I'm not going to say I don't have doubt because that's not true. But I don't have I don't agonize over it a lot, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is that I think I have such little time to write that I just jump in whenever I find that I have 20 minutes. Like I finished lunch early. I have 20 minutes till I need to be back on the clock. Like, let's set a timer. Let's do this. So.
Oh, hey, CNFers, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the craft of telling true stories. It's that guy who doesn't know how to move on from the conversation at the party, Brendan O'Mara. Sorry about that. It's that atavistian time of the month. And there aren't really any spoilers to think of in this story, a love story between the women Ashwini and Shri, an Indian and Nepalese couple who, against the odds, found each other, found love, and started a life together in San Francisco. It's a remarkable story told by Kelsey Rexroat. Kelsey is a freelance copy editor and also journalist, but she primarily makes her bones as a copy editor, having worked for The New Yorker, Groupon, Rand McNally, got a map, got a globe, and Amazon Pay. She's written for The New Yorker, LitHub, The Atlantic, and now the Atavist Magazine. Go to magazine.atavist.com to subscribe and read their award-winning journalism. I don't get any kickbacks or use affiliate links ever, so you know my recommendations are never skewed, man. By the time you hear this episode, I will be on my way to Seattle to catch Metallica for 2 nights. Now that my voice has fully recovered, I will categorically shred my vocal cords again. Show notes to this episode and more. Blog posts, my internet garden, if you will, are at brendano'mara.com. Hey, there you can subscribe to my monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, book recommendations, cool links, good vibes. First of the month, no spam, as far as I can tell. You can't beat it. Hey, parting shot for this is on the relapse of book anxiety and paying for a publicist, perhaps. Yeah, we're also going to hear from lead editor Jonah Ogles about Kelsey's piece to get a little insight from his side of the table. And I see no point in waiting any longer. So let's get after it, CNFers.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that attracted us to it initially, was that it's a break from what we usually do. And it's not like we're getting 1,200 love story pitches a year and rejecting all of them in favor of true crime. We just don't get many of them, And so when this came in, and I'm actually working on another love story that'll come out maybe later this year, early next. So when we get those, it's like somebody opens a window on a summer day. It's just like, yes, this would be so nice to spend my time thinking about this for like the next 3 months instead of, some of the darker stuff.
Right. And what's great about it, too, is that it shows other writers the possibilities. It's like, oh, there are these other avenues to pitch a story of this nature, and they do take these kind of things, and then they, take it into account to, balance some of the heavier things with something that is like opening the window on a summer day.
Yeah. And it's, they're harder. I think they're harder to sell in some ways because with a true crime pitch, the drama is inherent to the plot. And inherent might be not the right word, but you know what I'm saying. It's built in. And with a love story, it may not be like some of that drama and tension is shifted into the emotions, into the emotional life of the characters. And that's a much more difficult thing to do from a writing standpoint than to just describe, the bomb would go off in an hour. Like that's, if you're a writer who's like landed one of those stories, your job is done. You don't have to put on a literary writing hat if you don't want to. You can just like say what happened. But with a story like this, as Kelsey and I were working on it, there were moments where we were like, okay, here is a moment that really like needs to be fleshed out so that we get a better sense of the emotional landscape, so that readers are invested and care about what's going to happen to this character as we move forward in these chapters. And Kelsey did a remarkable job. It's not like it took a ton of work, or at least she made it seem effortless, but it still takes an intention to do that stuff.
Right. So, what were some of those challenges inherent to this particular piece with Kelsey?
Yeah, well, I think the big one was, what do you do when there's a gap between what your subject is telling you, and they both the subjects in the story, I think, were super cooperative and helpful. Sometimes even when they're being as helpful as they can be, there's a gap between what they've given the writer and what a story needs in order to feel dramatic, or to just feel like there's some emotional weight behind it. And so one of the last things we did on this, once we had sort of everything in place, was we really leaned into a few of those moments. And I kind of went through and just highlighted, like, here's a place, can we go deeper here? How about here? What about this spot? I just, like, any place I could even imagine, like adding, sort of plumbing more emotional depth, I would leave a comment, and then just told her, like, give me what you can, like, you don't have to fill all of this in, but on some of these moments I want to dwell a little bit, and we needed Kelsey to sort of put on, like, inhabit the character's mind a little bit and build out what they were thinking, even if they weren't quite able to tell her exactly what was going through their head. At that point, you're trusting that the writer has a good sense of their sources and what they were going through and all the plot points and the details, and that's where the literary part comes into it, where we're asking her to get into their heads and help readers sort of live that experience in a little more intimate way.
Yeah, sometimes once you get to know your sources or your central figures well enough, it sometimes becomes incumbent upon the writer to then to go ahead and make an assertion.
Mm-hmm.
You might be able to, if they're dead, of course, you can make assertions on their behalf because you've been swimming in that life for so long that you can connect a lot of dots. You've been triangulating from so many different sources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I suspect with her, she made some certain assertions as well, knowing Ashwini and Shri at the center of this. But she could also go back to them to some extent. But I imagine that there is some authorial assertion that takes place in a story of this nature.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, that's, I would feel way less comfortable doing that type of thing if we didn't have really good fact checkers who went back, because what you want is for the spirit of it to be true, And like, there's a line in here we were just kind of kicking around in this last round of fact check about Ashwini feeling like she was swimming away from herself, which is a quote she had given Kelsey. That was one of the moments where I'd push for more, and so what Kelsey ended up writing was that, she felt as if she was adrift in the ocean, swimming away from herself, and couldn't find a place where she felt safe, or find a safe harbor, or something like that. And the fact checker was like, hey, she didn't actually say she was in an ocean, she couldn't find a safe harbor, but the place where we arrived was that was, though she didn't say ocean and safe harbor, it fit with what she was experiencing, and it allowed us to go a little bit deeper, I hope, than just saying she felt as if she was always swimming away from herself.
Mm. And when Kelsey pitched this story to you, what was it that stood out the most when it came across your desk?
Huh. Well, I mean that it wasn't crime, that it was something, that there was like a happy ending, that no individuals came to great harm
Yeah.
during the story was certainly part of it. And I think also just the sort of the tone of Kelsey's pitch, which is very similar to the story itself. I don't know how to put it into words exactly, but it was intimate. It was an intimate portrait of a couple of people in their interior lives, and so often we're writing about people who are in jail or who have died, or aren't really available, either to comment, or they're available, but what matters most is kind of their role in this larger, like, plot driven narrative. And this was just more about like two people falling in love. And I am like a super sappy guy who cries at commercials. God, the Olympics are like a nightmare for me because all those mom commercials just like drop me to the floor. But it's that. I'm drawn to that. I'm like, yes, give me more stories like this.
Yeah, and I imagine too that where Ashwini is in San Francisco and she actively avoids looking at the Golden Gate Bridge because she wants to share that moment for when her partner and her future wife comes over to the States, and it's this that commitment to and delayed gratification to share a particular moment with someone, and the symbolism of the bridge too. That really comes together in a really beautiful way.
Yes, it does. And thank you for saying that. I'm a little bit sleep deprived today, but that was 100% a draw to us. Is like, because I mean, I've only been to San Francisco a couple of times, but it seems like an impossible task to avoid it, And so there's both like this internal journey that she's on and this external challenge that she set for herself of avoiding like the most iconic thing in the city, in order to like prove something, to this woman she loves. It's a nice moment. It's a nice story. I'm really, really grateful Kelsey sent it our way.
Oh, very nice. Yeah. So, yeah, as always, Joan, it's so cool getting your side of the table on this, and this is a really a cool like in the catalog of a year of Atavist stories. It's always nice to see how the stories like sort of play off each other and as always, just wonderful getting your side of the table and getting to unpack something that's definitely uplifting. Had its challenges for sure, but far more uplifting in the end.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brendan. It's always a pleasure being here.
All right, so now we've got Kelsey Rexroat. She is about to talk about her life as an editor and how she found out about this story, dealing with what she calls the monstrosity of a draft, squeezing out writing in 20-minute spurts, envy over those who have a bigger body of work than she does, and of course, the correct way to browse a used bookstore, okay? So here's Kelsey. Maybe you can elucidate me and the audience about the secret to shopping in a used bookstore.
I see you've done your research. Yes, my secret. So I've worked in 2 used bookstores, Housing Works in New York and Adobe Bookshop in the Mission neighborhood of San Francisco, where I live now. And my tip is to not go in with an agenda, to be willing to let the bookstore surprise you. And if you have some like specific interests, that's totally fine to go in looking for those, but to not go in expecting to find a specific author or specific title.
Yeah, it's best to surrender to the environment and get maybe even have that whole idea of like non-attachment going into a used bookstore.
Yes. Yeah, I was always disappointed when people would come in and ask for a specific book, and if I said that we didn't have it, they would just leave. Like that was the end of their time there. Like there's so much more here.
And I'm always interested in how writers or editors get into this morass that we're in and seemingly locked into for the rest of our days. And so, how did get into a life in words, be it copy editing and the reporting that you do?
Yeah, I'm primarily a copy editor. That's my day to day is copy editing, and I've been doing that for my entire career for a really wide range of businesses. Some of my more recent clients are like Apple and Blue Bottle Coffee, and I started right out of college with an internship. Was working for Rand McNally editing. Do you remember them? They made
Oh yeah,
paper maps.
maps.
Yeah, back when paper maps were a thing. They still exist, but
I have an atlas in my car. Like we have a United States one state by state atlas, and for those times when you are in remote locations, like especially when I get into say like Eastern Oregon. So I live in Western Oregon, but once you get into the eastern part of the state, your best chance at navigating things is usually with a paper map for sure. It's more reliable than cell service.
yeah, it's still a great idea to have on hand. But writing has always been, for me, something I do on the side. I've done a little bit for clients, but mostly it's been something that I've had the luxury of doing because I like to do it. And so for me, it fulfills a certain creative and intellectual itch that I get to use parts of my brain that copy editing doesn't really engage. So I like doing it, and I think it actually it's not why I do it, but I do think keeping a toe in the writing world helps make me a better copy editor, and the things I look for, the way I query, getting to be on the receiving end of editors and fact checkers keeps me humble. So,
Right. Yeah, and does being primarily an editor and doing the writing, like you said, more for the creative itch, a little more for fun, does that allow you to approach it with a greater sense of play and less pressure?
yeah, I get to focus on stories that I really want to write about, like this one with Ashwini for Atavist. It's a bonus that I get to write about stories I like about, but it's also a need because if I didn't enjoy the stories, it just wouldn't happen. I'm very busy with full-time copy editing. I'm the mother of a 2-year-old, so that's a good job in itself. So I have to really like the stories that I'm writing about for them to ever make it anywhere.
And with copy editing, and I do a little bit of copy editing for a publisher, just kind of ad hoc, kind of freelancy type thing. And I'm not. It's kind of a new gig, and so I'm in that flow a bit. And but here's something you've been doing for a long time. So when you're copy editing, how do you approach it? So you're catching the things you need to catch, and you're not burning your eyes out and everything. Yeah. How have you cultivated a practice around it, I should say?
Yeah, you have to take lots of little breaks with copy editing, or you will stop seeing things, stop catching things. So yeah, just turning your attention away completely for just a tiny bit at a time after each project. And reading everything twice, the second time I read something, I always like to copy and paste it into somewhere else. Like if it's in a PDF, I'll just paste it into a Google Doc and maybe change the font. Just changing it visually does so much to like make you see it in a different way and see things that you missed the first pass. So I always read everything twice in 2 different formats if I can.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and I've heard some editor types talk about just doing something as simple as changing the font. It does fundamentally alter how your eye sees it, and it's almost like reading something entirely new and wholly fresh.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that Courier New is supposed to be the font that like helps you catch the most mistakes, but I don't know. I haven't found any actual research to back that up. That's maybe just some editor lore.
Yeah, it's like the baseball analytics people. They're like, this is the one that on
Yeah.
this one catches seven times more errors than something else. I go to Comic Sans. It's a maddening.
Oh,
It's a maddening font, but that's the when
bold choice.
I know I compose in times, and I'll do a lot of my copy editing for my own work in Comic Sans, and yeah, call me a rebel, Kelsey, but I go Comic Sans. Oh, nice. So let's dive into your Atavist piece. So how did you come to know Ashwini and Shri in the story?
Yeah, I first found out about this story through my husband, actually. He was at a work event and they did that thing where you go around in a circle and you share your name and a fun fact about yourself. And Ashwini was at the event and she said that she lives in San Francisco, which is where we live, and has never seen the Golden Gate Bridge. And everyone was like a little taken aback by that. Like, you have to really go out of your way to not see the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. So he actually went and found her later, and was like, "So tell me about your fun fact. What's going on with that?" And she explained that her fiance was still in Nepal and she was waiting until they were reunited before she saw the bridge so that they could see it together for the first time. And he came home and he's like, "Oh, you're gonna love this story," correctly, because I did love it. It sounded like something out of a movie, this grand romantic gesture, and I was like, someone needs to write about this. And that's all I knew about the story at the time was this tiny little piece of it. So I got my husband to contact Ashwini to make an introduction to see if I could be that person that writes about it, and she was very hesitant at first. She actually didn't reply at all to our first email. I think the thought of sharing her story on a wider stage was understandably very nerve-wracking for her. Ashwini didn't come out until she was around 30. She had been like living her life very secretively, and so it was all very new to her. And she had some hesitations about that, which I totally understand. When I followed up just to make sure, at that point she said yes, she was ready to talk and she wanted to share the story, and Shri was willing to participate as well. So at that point I got to speak with both of them. So when I started with this story, I was really jumping in to the middle of it. They were still separated. So I got to pick up the story from there and follow it all the way to their reunion.
So what is your initial conversations with them to get them on board, and just the way you start pulling on threads to start formulating a narrative?
Well, I first spoke with Ashwini over the phone, and it was less an interview at that point. It was really just getting to hear more about her story. And like, that's when I found out, oh, there's so much more to this than just that hook of waiting to see the bridge. There's all these twists and turns. There's these coincidences and family rifts and divine intervention. So at that point, they were able to get reunited. Shri came to the United States, and I was able to sit down with both of them for an interview. They were both just like so generous with their time. We did a lot of interviews, and they were very long interviews, and they were so patient with me. I think if you put all of our interviews in a row, it would equate to an entire day of me just asking them questions from sunup to sundown nonstop, if not more.
As someone who's not like just doing like journalism every single day and you're picking and choosing the stories you want to do, how have you grown comfortable, or if you're not comfortable, just comfortable, say, dancing with just sometimes the awkwardness of just asking sometimes the most banal questions for various details, and just keep pulling on those threads, even if you can tell your sources are like, why the hell are you asking me this?
Yeah, that first interview we sat down they really just went through their story from beginning to end. And then each subsequent interview we didn't cover so much new ground at that point. It was really just me going back to some of these key scenes and asking them the same questions, slightly different, or getting more and more detail. And it is a little awkward to get into those hyper specific questions. It almost sounds like you're you're doubting their recounting of the story when you're like, what time was that exactly? Or what were you wearing? Sort of like an investigation. But they were incredibly gracious and patient with me and allowing me to get those details from them. I think with Shri especially, she's just this wonderfully matter-of-fact and stoic woman, and she tends to downplay everything when emotions are concerned. So I found it a lot harder to get into her head. And so revisiting the scenes multiple times and asking the questions in different ways to get a little more detail each time allowed me to weave those conversations together into cohesive scenes.
And at what point in your reporting did you feel comfortable pitching, and then, in this case, pitching it to the Atavist?
It was after the first main interview that I started pitching. And it's funny because when I first heard the story from my husband, I was picturing it as this cute little feel-good feature, just this in and out human interest write-up. I was even considering pitching Talk of the Town at the New Yorker, which is funny to me now because those pieces are like 500 words, and this ended up being closer to 9,000, I think. So when I considered Atavist, I had seen their pieces in the wild before, and I went to their website and I was looking at some of their more recent pieces just as a refresher. And they have some pretty dark material sometimes. There's like kidnappings and murder and crime investigations. And I was thinking, like, I don't know if this piece really fits here, but I looked at their submission guidelines and they say they're looking for cinematic stories. They had this wide list of topics that they consider, and they specifically mention romance among them. So it really came down to taking them at their word that what they said they were looking for is what they're looking for. And at least for my pitch, it turned out to be true. When
you were drawing up your pitch, and you said kind of at the start of our conversation too, being in the editor world and in the writing world, it kind of helps you see all facets of the chain, the production chain, if you will. And so when you were crafting this pitch, what was integral to you think it being, evocative enough for them to pick it up?
The hook with the bridge is definitely interesting, but then it ends up being so much more than that. It's this entire journey for every character in it, for Ashwini accepting herself for who she is, for Shri trusting Ashwini and going through all these hoops to move to 2 different countries, and for Ashwini's parents to accept their daughter, which was very difficult for them. So it was amazing watching all these threads and how they came together in the end.
And when you're constructing and structuring the piece, and it starts out with, Ashwini's in a car and they're unavoidably going to be near or driving over the Golden Gate Bridge, I think. And, she closes her eyes and everything just because she needs to keep that special and hold it and wait for it until Shri can come over to the States. When you're structuring the story, how did the structure reveal itself to you?
I knew early on that I wanted to start with that scene. It was really just going through, it's mostly chronological, just following their story. The harder part was deciding how much of the background to include about the laws in India and in Nepal around homosexuality, because I knew I wanted to tell that story too and give that context, because Ashwini and Shri were in this unique position of living so many of these events in real time, like the repealing of Section 377, and it gets reinstated and then it gets repealed again, and all of these events are having direct effects on their life. So they're living through this history. So I knew I wanted to weave that in too. And I did a lot of research on it, and most of it didn't make it into the story. I think I cut out a lot of it before I even submitted it. And then Jonah wisely cut even more of it out. So uh,
he's good at that.
yes. Yeah, he was a wonderful editor, did a great job of pushing me to add more details and then knowing when to cut back. So
And for people, it depends. Some people will read the story and listen to this. Some people will listen to this and read the story. So just for, you mentioned section 377, just for people who are unfamiliar or who will need a refresher, just what is that?
yes, that was part of the Indian Penal Code that was created in 1860, and it criminalized sexual acts that they considered unnatural, which basically applied to sodomy and homosexual activity. It was, introduced in 1860, and then like over the last couple of decades, it was temporarily repealed and then reinstated, and now it's been found unconstitutional, and so it's no longer illegal. Homosexual activity is no longer illegal in India, although same-sex marriage has still not been legalized.
And at what point did just the idea of the bridge reveal itself as something more than a bridge?
Good question. Living in San Francisco, I already have that sense that it's more than a bridge. It's it's this icon. It's a symbol of the city. It's a shorthand for San Francisco. And interviewing Ashwini and Shri, like seeing how they saw it as the same thing when before they even came to San Francisco, they knew so little about the city. Ashwini knew it as this place where all these tech companies got their start, and Shri knew it as more of the hippie associations, like a place where you can be yourself. But beyond that, really, all they knew about it was the bridge. So it stood out to me as this beacon for them, for this goal along this journey that they're taking to try to make it to somewhere where they can live their lives freely.
Yeah, and my favorite passage from the entire piece is it's at the very end, and I'll just read the paragraph and we can unpack it a little more. You write, a blanket of fog hung low over the Marin headlands in the distance, and they zipped up their jackets to protect against the Bay Area's characteristic late spring chill. Ashwini thought about the massive engineering undertaking that had brought the bridge into being. Perhaps with modern tools and technology, it wouldn't be so hard to build the bridge today. Maybe it would even be considered easy. But when it was built in the 1930s, the endeavor had taken steadfast vision and unwavering perseverance. Her journey to be with Shri felt similar, full of setbacks, delays, and discouragement toward a goal that sometimes felt like little more than a fantasy. And I love that passage. And to me, also, like the bridge and the engineering and the technology and the evolution, it kind of speaks in a way towards just gay rights over the years. It starts small, but maybe with with vision and wonder and open-mindedness, it could build into something far greater, going forward than it has been in the past, and hopefully more accelerated.
And across the world, and in India especially, it's a story that's still being written. These laws are still being challenged over and over, and I really hope for a better outcome for the gay community there in the future.
Yeah, I think a particularly heartbreaking part in the story as well is, you come to know that Ashwini's parents are very supportive of her and, love her and are fairly, progressive given their culture, and with arranged marriages, they gave her kind of like veto power over that. And and she and she saw how her father was a stay-at-home father and her mother went out to work, and they had such a real nice relationship, and he had like a kind of progressive ideas. And then when it comes when Ashwini comes out to them and her mother tells her father, even though she didn't want her to do that, basically she is met with disapproval, and it's such a gut punch, and you feel so deeply for her at that point. And that's comes at a moment in the story where you're like, oh shoot, like what's gonna happen here, and you desperately just feel for her.
Yeah, it's a really tough part for her. And I think part of the reason she came around to wanting to do this story is she was so close to her parents, and she grew up with the model of their marriage as something that she aspired to. They had such a strong marriage and loved each other so much, and she aspired to that. But even when she knew that she liked women, it wasn't a future she could picture for herself. She saw her parents' marriage and the happiness there, but she had never known anyone gay growing up. She had never seen anyone living a normal, happy life in a queer relationship. And the only stories she saw about the LGBT community in the Indian media growing up were not portraying it in a positive light. So she really hopes that like reading her and Tree's story can help people believe that there is a happy ending possible for them. And like we know that representation matters, and I believe that there will be people out there who are inspired by them.
Oh, for sure. And I think your skill in the story and telling it is, especially in building up her parents as what seemingly, and they grow to be very accepting, but you kind of almost feel like they're going to be that way right off the bat. And when they definitely shun it, you're like, oh, wow. Like it kind of, it really cut against the expectation that I was feeling. I'm like, I hope they like, I want them to accept it. I think they're gonna accept it. And like, shit, they don't. And you're like,
Yeah.
holy cow! Like, how is she? You just feel that desperation and that loss. There's a mourning there that that they feel for each other in that moment, and you just know that that's happened to countless hundreds and thousands of queer people who have had that conversation with their parents and are similarly shunned, and then they have to find a way somehow.
Yes. And it's amazing that they do come around, but for a while there she did have to live out her worst fear. Like what she was afraid would happen did happen, and fortunately they have come around.
Yeah, and they came around to put Shri up during the pandemic and everything, and all of it's like it came out kind of indirectly to Ashwini in a way, like the full arc of the acceptance. It was like Shri became accepted before Ashwini in a way, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's just like, holy, like, wow, like that's what a way to learn of your acceptance, and then to build, to use the bridge metaphor, bridges from there.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the story is her parents. They're not motivated really by even liking Shri at that point. They're motivated by honor. Like they have this deep sense of family honor. Like you're responsible for her and we're your family, so we're responsible for her. But then that turns into love and acceptance of Shri.
And so as you're writing the piece and reporting it, or let's say as you're reporting it out, at what point, and this can extend to any other piece of journalism you've done, but especially to this one, at what point do you feel like you're ready to start writing over the course of your reporting? I
am a person who likes to gather as much as possible before I really set pen to paper. So yeah, I did multiple interviews. I did a lot of research on the Indian laws and all of that before I ever really started. Although the pitch itself kind of becomes an outline for the story, so that would sort of counts as pre-writing.
Right. Is that something you like to try to almost tack up to your board there? Do you like an outline? Something of a map. Rand McNally days. Something of a of a map that you can follow. Detour from every now and again, but definitely something as a wireframe.
I do. I don't know if it could be called an outline, but I make a very sloppy draft of everything. All the research I've gathered, I kind of cut and paste it into a document in the order that I want the piece to be in, and then just go through the piece and clean it up. But basically let my copy editing brain take over at that point and say, what is this monstrosity? And then clean it up. And so, yeah, I'll just put whole like block entire block quotes and entire paragraphs of research. Just I end up with a draft that's like 4 times longer than the actual piece will be, and then start narrowing it down.
Now, when you're staring down the barrel of a monstrosity, how do you wrestle with sometimes the doubt that creeps in as you're like, how the hell do I get my head around this? I'm off the wheels, man. Like, get me back on this road.
I'm not going to say I don't have doubt because that's not true. I don't have I don't agonize over it a lot, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, is that I think I have such little time to write that I just jump in whenever I find that I have 20 minutes. Like I finished lunch early. I have 20 minutes till I need to be back on the clock. Like, let's set a timer. Let's do this. So I think maybe just being on constant deadline in my own head it helps keep things moving.
Oh, for sure. It's funny when I talk to like reporters about that question, a lot of them just kind of laugh or scoff. Like, I don't have time to have self-doubt. You know, it's the deadline is there to quell that voice. And then other people who have maybe a longer runway or try to be, are, for lack of a better term, are more like artistic in their writing and really sink in it and swim in it. That allows the doubt and the 2 a.m. voices to creep into the head all the more, which isn't to say it doesn't happen to people who are on more strict deadlines, but it's sometimes that deadline is just like, I don't have time to worry about it. And like to your point, you're like, I got 20 minutes, I'm going to go. And no doubt, I'm just get down what I can and worry about it later.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's... Do you wrestle with a 3 a.m. voice? That's when mine hits me and wakes me up out of bed and tells me how bad I am and how the book I'm working on is garbage and no one's going to buy it and it's actually probably going to get turned around by the publisher and I'm going to have to return my advance. So how do you deal with that voice, Kelsey?
That's rough. I do feel... I don't feel that while I'm working on something, but as soon as it's out of my hands, like I've sent it off and then I'm like, I get that dread, like, oh, people are actually going to read this. Like you can ignore that fact until it's out the door and then it's out there in the world. And that's when I start to have the self-doubt. But
oh, for sure. Because then it's up to, it's no longer yours and it's in their hands for interpretation or misinterpretation. And it's like, that's not what I meant. And now you're going to rake me over the coals or, if it's something that can be rated and reviewed and you're like, damn it. Like they missed the point or maybe I did fuck up and now you have to live with that. It's that's a terrifying feeling for sure.
Yeah, I don't have the 3 a.m. thoughts, but I do have sometimes I have trouble making it through a book because I'll read a really good sentence and then I'm like thinking about a sentence I wrote somewhere and then I'm like I have to go change that. I have to go make it better. So.
That's really funny. Is that is that when like the editor brain is trespassing a bit much into your writer brain?
Oh, definitely. It doesn't always know when to stay in its lane.
Yeah, how do you put a firewall between the two so one's not polluting on the other too much?
Yeah, it's tough. I used to have a lot harder time with it because I thought every sentence I wrote had to be perfect as I was writing it. And there's the writer advice everyone's heard is to like write ugly, and that's been a hard place for me to get to, but I do think that I have gotten there with the monstrosity drafts that I mentioned. So yeah, it's taken a lot of practice, but I've gotten better at that.
Oh, Kelsey, if you could see the draft that I wrote of this, this book that I've recently turned in, like the early writing, and I've like been at this for 20 years, and It's amazing how bad you can still be after 20 years of doing something. It's it's simultaneously encouraging and discouraging at the same time. It's horrible. Is
Yeah.
that something like, it's just, you've probably been at it a similar amount of time, give or take a few years.
Hmm.
But it's like, are you kind of amazed at kind of how, as skilled as you've become, how hard it still is?
Yeah, with on the writing side for sure. I feel
Yeah.
like um, writing, maybe it becomes a little faster, but it doesn't become easier. It's always going to be you trying to pull the best out of your brain. So the best is always going to be just a little bit out of reach.
Yeah. And when you're comparing yourself, or at least putting, or trying to compose to the ideal of the people you admire most, like who are some of those writers and that you aspire to do similar work as?
I think I read a lot of fiction, and the authors that always bug me, that I'm always just like putting the book down and running to my own computer, are authors like Marilyn Robinson and Rachel Cusk. Not sure if I'm saying her name right, but I love Anne Carson's poetry. And they have they're not what you would call like plot driven authors.
Mm-hmm.
They're, it's very like, I read it for the writing, and that their writing definitely inspires me. As far as like nonfiction, like journalists, I used to work as a web producer at the New Yorker, part time, and so I've read a lot of New Yorker, and they have such a amazing cast of editors there. Catherine Schultz, Gia Tolentino. I've been following her since her hairpin days. R.I.P. the hairpin.
Mm-hmm.
But and she's now a mother too. I love that she's like, the things she writes about have been evolving as my life has been evolving. It's like, oh, we're growing up together. But
Right.
yeah, there's just an incredible amount of amazing authors out there.
Longtime listeners of this show know that I started this out of a crucible of like resentment and jealousy, and trying to metabolize those feelings a bit better because they were really just pulling me down into the mud. And I wonder for you, like, you look at people you admire like that, and there's always a tendency to look over your shoulder and compare yourself to other people. And have you wrestled with that at all? Just those kind of those bitter resentments that it doesn't burn clean, but it's something that always kind of festers, I think, in the deepest part of our gut.
I don't know. Maybe because this isn't my full time job of writing, that it more inspires me to write than the feeling. I mean, there's definitely some jealousy there, but
Uh-huh.
more inspiring overall.
Right. When I was talking with Hanifa Durakib about that, he spun it in a way that, if he's feeling envy or jealousy, he calls it more of a sister to awe. And,
Mm-hmm.
so he's reframed it in that to be like, oh, I'm feeling crummy about it, but no, it means I just deeply admire what they're doing, and it turned it more into inspiration versus this bitterness. And that's a very enlightened way of looking at it, and I imagine it probably took him years to kind of reach that point, and maybe not. I know it's certainly taken me years to reach that point, but it is one of those things where, oh, it just means like, oh, I kind of want that thing, but I just need to recognize and admire the people who have come before me, but use them as inspiration to try to put my own spin on similar work.
And one area where I do feel a little jealous is like seeing other writers' output, since I definitely am not generating as much as a lot of people. But I think the most important advice that works for me is to like not focus on progress, like not focus on a certain word count every day or anything like that, but just to
Mm-hmm.
focus on consistency, just being consistent over time. And if you do that, then the progress comes automatically.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I feel like, to me, I'm like such a late bloomer. I feel like I'm about 10 years behind where like most people in my age group are. And I just have to kind of accept that and kind of turn my mind to a more slow productivity mindset, to borrow the new Cal Newport mindset. And it's like, yeah, to your point, you know, if you trust that, you run your own race or plow your own acre, you know, over the course of your career and your life, you know, you're going to look behind you and be like, oh, that's a pretty big body of work. But in the moment, it might have felt like, why haven't I done more work? But if you just do it methodically, you'll look behind you and be like, oh wow, that's a career there. Those are things I can parlay into other things. That's a pretty nice, yeah, it's a pretty nice trail of wreckage I've left behind.
Yes. Useful wreckage.
Useful wreckage.
You
I
can
like that.
Scavenge for parts from.
Very nice. Well, Kelsey, this is wonderful to get to talk to you about. You know, everything that you did in this wonderful piece, this wonderful love story, and it's really I'm gonna add to the catalog of Atavist stories and provide ballast for some of the darker things that have come through, especially the last few have been bleak, and so this was definitely a bright light. I think that they're greatly appreciative. So just thanks for coming on the show and talking shop. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
Yes. All right. Thanks to Jonah, Kelsey, and of course the Atavist. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and smash that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. Consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, just to help the wayward CNFer say, wow, I'll give that no name a shot. Got the first chunk of my final edits back, and make no mistake, it is, I have been told, I'm like, this is it, BO. This is the final pass, because after this it goes to copy edits and then you're hosed. My words. But and by and large, I finally crested out of anxiety and into the realm of excitement. You know, the first time in nearly 2 years that I've been excited and not trembling. Then my editor was like, we got to retool this first chapter. You know, first chapters are just too important to futz with. It's only a 7-pager, but those 7-pagers could kill the book for a reader if they're not doing the right kind of work. And after a long conversation about it, I relapsed into panic and stress eating. I basically ate an entire jar of peanut butter in the span of 48 hours. I drank like several big beers at a baseball game at significant personal cost and haven't been able to sleep. The borderline insomnia preceded the drinking, which I know makes me sleep like garbage anyway. And no, the answer is I don't have good coping skills. I didn't know what more I could do to this chapter, so I started just retyping it. You know, moving one anecdote to the top of the chapter that forefronts Steve Prefontaine in a way that it didn't before, and then I started folding all that stuff into what's chapter 2 and moving some other things around that maybe this former chapter 1 would then just be an accent piece in chapter 2. And the more I retooled that, the more the original chapter 1 just kind of came back into focus, which is parts moved around, and then chapter 2 went back into its room. I don't have much time to tinker on this kind of shit. I was told that this is, like I said, the final back and forth, and then we got to move on to copy edits. So I'm feeling the crunch. You know, the panics are back, the 2 a.m. book panics. But amidst this fury, I got the book cover mock-up, and it's really good. It's a really great cover. I love it. I had no input in the design, but I do love it, so that's nice. It'll still be several weeks before I can share it in the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter or Black Instagram. I just threw up a little in my mouth. The manuscript will likely get down to about 105,000 words or fewer, down from 160,000. So yeah, I'm pretty fucking shitty at writing books. I think I already said this once, but my acknowledgement section is largely going to be a litany of apologies, big and small, mainly big. You're trying to find photos still, get the rights. Thinking about the PR plan. Like, is there a budget to send me places? I don't know. Should I hire an outside publicist? Should I spend the $5,000 at minimum of book advance money? Like, $5,000 is a lot of money. And it's no guarantee that it'll be worth it. I could spend that and not be featured on any prominent podcasts or radio programs or MTV. Hell, there are dozens and dozens of publicists who reach out to me for their authors, and I ignore most of them. So that's money that the author spent on these publicists, and me, I'm ignoring them. Like, that's a waste of money. And I don't ignore them to be a dick. I can only read so much, and I only have 50 slots a year, give or take, 12 of which I reserve for Atavist writers. So any given year, there'll be about 38 to 40 authors and creators that can get in, and then a chunk of that is often repeats, and a chunk of that sometimes is just magazine stories. Anyway, I probably get pitched more than 100 books a year, which probably isn't that much in the grand scheme, but it's far more than I can handle. You know, I can read maybe at most 50 books a year, and even that's a stretch. It's probably closer to 40. For all intents and purposes, the podcast doesn't make any money, so I can't really spend any more time than I already do on it. It makes like $100 a month from Patreon. But I spend the equivalent of a robust part-time job every week on it. There's no way I can honor all those pitches. I don't know how Brad Listy with other people does 2 author interviews a week and has the capacity to read. Maybe his show actually is his job and he can actually commit the time. If that's so, well, cool. So that $5,000 or so on a publicist, like, if that equates to, if it gets you on the coveted bestseller lists, you know, then that makes me just a more marketable, bankable commodity. Because make no mistake, when you get into this racket, you're a product, you know. And so it's like, are you a certain kind of stock or something? And if you get on that list, that's something they can slap on a book cover, and it makes you more attractive, which can lead to future book deals. So is that $5,000? That $5,000 could be seen as an investment. What if that leads to a $200,000 advance? You know, then I'd be set for another 4 or 5 years. So it's something I'll flirt with. And, well, shit, it kind of sort of need to be thinking hard about this, like, now. And I mean literally right this second now. So stay wild, see you nevers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.